He said it as a joke. A throwaway line at a company party, the kind of thing you say when you're 3 drinks in and exhausted and just trying to make people laugh. Honestly, my only real financial plan at this point is marrying a billionaire CEO. The room laughed. His coworkers slapped him on the back. Someone clinked glasses with him. Victoria Sinclair didn't laugh. She looked at him from across the room, calm, unreadable, a woman who had built $100 million company before she turned 30. And she didn't look away. The next morning, his phone buzzed with a message from her assistant. Miss Sinclair requests a private meeting, 9 a.m., her office. Logan Hayes had no idea that joke was about to become his entire life. If you're already hooked, hit that like button and drop a comment with the city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story has traveled. Now, let's get into it. The alarm went off at 5:47. Logan didn't need it anymore, hadn't needed it for months, if he was being honest. His body had figured out a long time ago that sleep past 5:30 was a luxury that no longer belonged to him, and it had simply stopped trying. He lay on his back in the dark for maybe 90 seconds, staring at the ceiling of a bedroom that still felt too large for one person, before he swung his legs over the edge of the mattress and sat there with his elbows on his knees, letting the day arrive. The apartment was quiet in the specific way it got before Mia woke up. Not peaceful. There was nothing peaceful about a stillness you knew was temporary, but suspended, like the whole place was holding its breath. He stood, cracked his back, shuffled to the kitchen in socks that didn't match, and started the coffee maker because the day couldn't happen without coffee. Not anymore, not at 32 with 6 hours of sleep and a stack of account reports due by noon. While the machine gurgled and spit, he leaned against the counter and looked at the refrigerator. There was a drawing on it, held up by a magnet shaped like a pineapple. Mia had made it 2 weeks ago. A family portrait, the way 8-year-olds draw them. All circular heads and stick limbs and crayon colors that don't match anything in real life. There was a tall figure with brown hair that was supposed to be him, and a smaller figure with pigtails that was obviously her, and between them she had written "Me and Daddy" in her careful, slightly too large handwriting. 2 figures. Just 2. Logan looked at it for a second longer than he meant to, then looked away and poured his coffee. He'd been at Sinclair Capital Group for 2.5 years. Before that, there had been a different job, a different apartment, a different version of his life that still felt sometimes like it had belonged to another person. He'd worked at a mid-sized investment firm downtown, decent salary, good trajectory, the kind of career you built slowly and steadily and expected to still have in 20 years. Then Sarah got sick. Then the medical bills started. Then she was gone, and he was 30 years old with an orphaned grief and a 6-year-old daughter and a bank account that had been slowly hollowed out by 2 years of treatment costs that health insurance hadn't come close to covering. He'd kept the apartment. He didn't know why. It was too much space and too much money, and every corner of it reminded him of her. But Mia was already dealing with enough, and he hadn't wanted to uproot her from her school and her friends on top of everything else. So he'd stayed and tightened every other expense and taken the job at Sinclair Capital because it paid 18% more than anywhere else he'd interviewed. And sometimes you made decisions with a spreadsheet instead of your heart, because your heart was too tired to do the math. Sinclair Capital Group operated out of a 40-story glass building in the financial district, and it was the kind of company that had a different energy depending on which floor you were on. The lower floors, accounting, analysis, operations, felt like any large financial firm. Efficient, slightly sterile, the low hum of people doing serious work under fluorescent lights. But the upper floors, where the executive suites were, had a different quality, quieter, more deliberate. The air even seemed different up there, like it had been filtered through something expensive. Logan had been to the executive floors exactly twice in 2.5 years. He was a senior financial analyst. He did good work, met his deadlines, kept his head down, and went home to his daughter every evening by 6:30 if the train cooperated. He wasn't invisible. His manager liked him. His team respected him. But he wasn't exactly climbing toward anything either. He was surviving, holding the line, keeping the lights on, and Mia fed, and the future from collapsing completely. That was enough. That had to be enough. The gala was Marcus's fault. Marcus Webb sat 2 desks over and had the specific personality type that made company events feel mandatory, even when they weren't. He was 35 and divorced, and genuinely enjoyed social functions the way some people genuinely enjoyed running marathons. with an enthusiasm that Logan found slightly baffling but fundamentally harmless. "You're going," Marcus had said 3 days before the event, not as a question. "I wasn't planning on it." "Logan, it's an open bar. The company rents out the Meridian Hotel ballroom. There are shrimp cocktails. I have Mia. Your neighbor, the one with the cats, she watches Mia all the time. Mrs. Calloway has a book club on Thursdays. It's Friday." Logan had looked at him. "I called her," Marcus said, completely unapologetic. "She said she's free and she'd love to. She also said, and I'm quoting directly here, that you need to get out of the apartment more before you turn into a hermit crab." She said hermit crab specifically? Her words, not mine. So that was how Logan ended up at the Meridian Hotel on a Friday night, in a suit that still fit but felt slightly wrong, like it belonged to the version of himself from 3 years ago who had owned it under different circumstances. The ballroom was exactly as advertised. 300 people, open bar, shrimp cocktails, the kind of ambient jazz that was designed to fill space without demanding attention. He'd had 2 drinks by 8:30, talked to people he recognized from other departments, nodded through conversations about Q3 projections and the new compliance software rollout, and was genuinely calculating whether he could leave before 9 without it being obviously rude when Marcus materialized at his elbow with a fresh drink and an expression that said, "Here we go." "You see who's actually here tonight?" Logan accepted the drink. "I've been trying not to inventory the room. Victoria Sinclair," Marcus said in the tone of a man announcing a weather event. "She never comes to these things. Like, literally never. I've been here 4 years and I've seen her at exactly one company event before tonight, and I'm pretty sure that one was mandatory." Logan turned slightly. On the far side of the room, near the floor-to-ceiling windows, there was a small constellation of people arranged around a woman in a dark dress. He'd seen her photograph on the company website, in quarterly reports, in the framed portrait on the wall of the executive lobby. In person, she was, he searched for the right word, present in a way that photographs didn't capture. Not beautiful exactly, or not just that. More like someone who had learned to take up exactly as much space as she intended to, and not 1 inch more. "She looks like she'd rather be anywhere else," Logan said. Marcus squinted. "Yeah, actually, she kind of does." The comment happened at 9:15. He was with a group of 6 people. Marcus, a woman named Diana from compliance, 2 analysts he knew vaguely from the 4th floor, and a managing director named Robert something who had a handshake like a car door closing. Someone had started talking about the real estate market, which led to mortgages, which led to interest rates, which somehow led to someone asking Logan, probably because he was visibly the most financially anxious person in the group, whether he was planning to buy a place or stay renting. "Stay renting," Logan said, "for the foreseeable future." "Might be worth looking at options," Robert, the managing director, said, in the tone of someone who had not personally looked at apartment prices in about 15 years. "Rates are uncomfortable right now, but my current financial plan involves making it to next Tuesday," Logan said. He was aiming for dry, and he got there. The group laughed, including Robert. "Honestly? Best case scenario, I marry a billionaire CEO and let her figure it out." More laughter. Marcus nearly choked on his drink. Diana covered her mouth. Someone said, "There you go," and someone else said, "Solid strategy." Logan was grinning, had already moved to take a sip of his drink, when he registered the quiet. Not silence. The ballroom was still full of noise, but in his immediate vicinity, something had shifted. He followed the sight lines of the people around him, the way Robert had gone slightly stiff, the way Diana's smile had become a different shape, and turned. Victoria Sinclair was standing 6 feet away. She had clearly been moving through the room when the comment landed. She'd stopped. Her expression was unreadable in the specific way that suggested she'd had years of practice making it unreadable, but she was looking at him directly, and there was something in her eyes that wasn't amusement and wasn't offense and wasn't anything he had a clean name for. The moment lasted maybe 3 seconds. Then she said, to no one in particular, "Enjoy your evening," and continued moving through the room. Logan stood there. "Well," Marcus said very quietly, "that was either completely fine or catastrophically not fine, and I genuinely cannot tell which." Logan set his drink down carefully. "I think I'm going to go home." Probably smart. The message came at 7:14 the next morning. He was in the middle of helping Mia find her left shoe. It had turned up behind the bathroom door inexplicably, when his phone buzzed on the kitchen counter. He glanced at it, expecting Marcus with some variation of, well, you still have a job, right? The sender was listed as E. Park, Office of the CEO. Mr. Hayes, Ms. Sinclair requests a brief meeting at your earliest availability this morning, 9 a.m., 38th floor. Please confirm receipt. Mia appeared from the hallway with her shoe on the wrong foot and her backpack hanging off one shoulder. Who texted you? Work, Logan said. Is it bad? He looked at the message again. I have genuinely no idea. He confirmed the meeting, dropped Mia at school, and spent the entire train ride to work running through possibilities. The rational part of his brain said it was probably nothing. Maybe she wanted to address the comment directly, professionally, close the loop. Maybe HR was involved and this was a formal thing. Maybe she'd barely registered the comment, and this was about something else entirely, some financial report he'd submitted, some analysis he'd done 3 weeks ago. The less rational part of his brain kept replaying the look on her face. Not amusement and not offense. Something else. Something considered. The 38th floor felt different at 9 in the morning than the rest of the building. Quieter, with the kind of deliberate arrangement that said this space was designed by someone who thought carefully about what a space communicates. The reception area had low furniture in neutral colors and real plants that actually looked healthy. A woman who was presumably E. Park stood when he stepped off the elevator and guided him to a waiting area with the practiced efficiency of someone who handled access to powerful people for a living. He waited 4 minutes. Then the door opened and E. Park said, Ms. Sinclair will see you. And Logan stood up, straightened his jacket, and walked into the room. The office occupied a corner of the building, 2 full walls of windows, the city spread out below in the gray morning light. There was a desk, large, clear of clutter, a single laptop and a folder and a glass of water, and behind it, Victoria Sinclair. She looked different from the night before. The dark dress had been replaced by a charcoal blazer and dark slacks, her hair pulled back in a way that was functional rather than styled. No jewelry, except a watch. She looked like someone who had been working since 6 a.m. and intended to continue working until 8 p.m. and had allocated this meeting a specific window. Mr. Hayes, she said, sit down. He sat. She looked at him for a moment, not unkindly, but directly, the way people looked at something they were assessing. I'm going to be straightforward with you, because I find that directness saves time, and I don't have a great deal of time to spare. Okay, Logan said. Last night's comment, the billionaire CEO remark. I want to apologize for... I'm not looking for an apology. She said it simply, without sharpness. I'm looking to understand whether it came from actual desperation or just conversational noise. He blinked. I'm sorry? She folded her hands on the desk. I pulled your HR file this morning. Employment record, compensation history, the summary your department head submits annually. You're a strong analyst. Your work is good. Your numbers are reliable, and you're consistently underpaid for your output, which is something I intend to address separately. She paused. I also saw a notation from your benefits coordinator about an ongoing medical claim for a dependent. Your daughter. The air in the room felt slightly different. That's not... He stopped, started again. That's private. It is, she agreed, and I'm not using it as leverage. I'm using it as context, because what I'm about to propose is something I need you to understand clearly, without softening. Logan said nothing. His hands were resting on his knees, and he consciously kept them still. Victoria Sinclair reached for the folder on her desk and opened it. 18 months ago, I made a financial arrangement with 3 institutional investors to fund a significant expansion of this company. The arrangement included specific performance clauses, which the company has met. It also included a personal clause that I did not anticipate the investors actually enforcing. What kind of clause? She looked at him. That I marry someone they approve of before my 31st birthday. The language was vague, inserted deep in a 30-page term sheet, and my lawyers at the time failed to flag it as anything other than a formality. Her voice didn't change. It was not a formality. My 31st birthday is in 11 weeks. Logan stared at her. They can't actually enforce that. They can block my board vote, which gives them effective operational control. They can also trigger a poison pill clause that would allow them to replace me as CEO and install their own management team. She closed the folder. The company my father started in a rented office with 12 employees. that I rebuilt after he died and turned into what it is now. That would cease to be mine in any meaningful sense. The silence stretched for a moment. So the comment last night, Logan said slowly. I had already been exploring options, Victoria said. I had a list of candidates, business associates, people whose circumstances might make an arrangement mutually beneficial. Your comment suggested you might be open to an unconventional solution. I was making a joke. I know. For the first time, something shifted almost imperceptibly at the corner of her mouth. Not quite a smile, but the acknowledgement that one could exist. That's actually why I'm talking to you instead of the other people on my list. He looked at her. Because I was joking. Because you were honest. The joke was honest. The desperation underneath it was honest. I don't want someone who'll perform this arrangement with ambition. I want someone who'll do it practically, keep their word, and not try to extract more than we agree to. Logan let out a slow breath. You're serious? Completely. You want to... He stopped. Reorganized the sentence. You're proposing a fake marriage. A temporary legal marriage, she said. Structured, contractual, with clear terms on both sides. Compensation, duration, expectations. It would need to be convincing enough to satisfy the investors, which means some level of public presence together. Your daughter, Mia, would need to be accounted for in the arrangement. I wouldn't expect you to hide her existence. She's 8. I know. She doesn't understand. I can't explain to an 8-year-old that her father is... He stopped again, rubbed his face briefly. This is insane. Yes, Victoria said. It is. I'm going to decline, Logan said. He said it clearly, without anger, but definitely. I appreciate that you were direct with me, and I'm sorry about your situation, and I genuinely hope you find a solution. But I have a kid and a job and a life that's already complicated, and I'm not... Of course, she said. That's a reasonable position. She picked up a business card and set it on the edge of the desk, facing him. If anything changes, my direct number is on that card. The offer stands for 2 weeks. He stood, picked up the card, more out of reflex than intention. One more thing, she said, as he turned toward the door. He stopped. The medical claim in your file. The ongoing treatment for your daughter. She paused briefly. What does she have? He turned back, looked at her. Leukemia, he said. She's been in remission for 8 months, but the maintenance treatment continues for another 18 months, and the out-of-pocket costs are... He stopped. You don't need to know this. No, Victoria said. I don't. He looked at her for one more second, then walked out. He held it together until he got back to his own floor. Then he went to the men's room, stood at the sink with the water running, and just breathed for a while. Leukemia. He hadn't said that word out loud to someone he barely knew in a very long time, and something about saying it in that room, in that context, with the city spreading gray and distant below them, had done something to the air in his lungs. Mia had been diagnosed 14 months ago. 8 months in remission was good. The oncologist was cautiously optimistic, which in oncologist language meant something between, we think she's okay, and we're not ready to say for certain. The maintenance chemo was lower intensity, but still a cost, still a schedule, still the particular terror of watching your child be sick and doing math at the same time because the math never stopped. He'd refinanced the apartment 14 months ago to cover the initial treatment costs. The loan was underwater now. The value of the apartment hadn't moved, but his debt load had. He had a grace period on the second mortgage that ended in 6 weeks. His mother had offered to help, and he'd refused because she was 67 and on a fixed income, and he wasn't taking her retirement money. His sister was in Phoenix with her own family and her own mortgage, and he hadn't told her how bad it had gotten because he didn't want her to worry. He stood at the sink for 4 more minutes. Then he dried his hands and went back to his desk and opened his email and worked until noon. He didn't call the number on the card. He told himself he wouldn't, and for the first 3 days he didn't, and by the 4th day the card was still in his jacket pocket, and he'd convinced himself that was just because he hadn't cleaned out his pockets yet, not because he was considering anything. On the 5th day, the letter from the bank arrived. He read it twice, standing in the kitchen in his work clothes while Mia ate dinner at the table behind him, and told him about what happened at recess. Foreclosure proceedings initiating. The letter used language that was precise and legal and completely merciless. 60 days to respond or make arrangements. His grace period hadn't ended in 6 weeks. He'd miscalculated, or maybe the terms had adjusted, or maybe he'd just been so tired for so long that he'd been slightly wrong about everything. "Daddy," Mia said. "1 second, baby." "You've been standing there for a long time." He folded the letter, turned around. She was looking at him with the specific expression she'd developed in the last year. Careful, watching, older than 8-year-olds were supposed to be. The leukemia had done that. It had taken a confident, occasionally chaotic little girl who used to run headfirst into everything and installed this secondary awareness, this monitoring instinct. She watched him the way she'd learned to watch for signs that something was wrong. He hated that it had done that to her. He hated it more than he had words for. "I'm fine," he said. "How was the meatballs?" "Good. I left you some." "You didn't have to do that." "I know." She shrugged, the pure 8-year-old practicality of it. "I just did." He put the letter in the drawer under the counter, put her to bed at 8:30, read 2 chapters of the book she was currently obsessed with, waited until her breathing evened out, and then went back to the kitchen and sat down at the table with the letter and his phone and the business card. He looked at all 3 objects for about 15 minutes. Then he picked up the phone. Victoria answered on the second ring. "Mr. Hayes." "How did you know it was me?" "I only gave that number to 3 people this week, and both of the others already called." A pause. Not uncomfortable. "I wondered if you'd call." "I haven't decided anything," he said immediately. "I understand. I have questions." "That's reasonable." He had written them down on the back of an envelope because he was a financial analyst, and that's what he did with things that needed to be assessed. He made lists. The contract terms. Duration, compensation, and what happens to my job. Maximum 2 years, likely shorter depending on how quickly the investor situation resolves. Compensation would be structured as a salary supplement paid through a separate vehicle, not tied to your employment at Sinclair Capital, so your job isn't conditional on the arrangement and vice versa. She paused. "I thought that would matter to you." "It does." He looked at the next item on his list, Mia's medical care. Covered. Full coverage, out of network, no caps. Retroactive to your agreement date for any outstanding balances. He made himself breathe. It's not charity," she said. "It's a term of the contract. You'd be providing something I need, and I'd be providing something you need. That's a transaction." He didn't say anything for a moment. "What about her?" he asked. "What does she get told?" "That's your call," Victoria said. "You know your daughter. I have a proposed framework for how the living arrangement could work, if you want to hear it, but I won't tell you how to parent. We'd have to live together. Not necessarily constantly, but enough to be credible. Photographs, public appearances, events. The investors will do due diligence. They'll look for a real relationship. And when it ends? Amicable divorce, agreed terms, both parties walk away with what was promised. You'd have no obligation to me after the contract concludes." He looked at the foreclosure letter. "Mr. Hayes," Victoria said quietly, "I'm not asking you to like this. I'm asking you to consider it." "I know." He pressed his fingers against the bridge of his nose. "Can I have until Sunday?" "Yes." "I'll call you Sunday morning. I'll be available." He hung up. Sat in the kitchen in the silence for a long time. Then got up, went to Mia's room, stood in the doorway for a minute watching her sleep in the nightlight's dim glow. Small and real and breathing steadily, her hair a mess against the pillow, one arm thrown over her stuffed rabbit, and made a decision that he knew, even then, was going to change everything. He called Sunday morning. He said yes. There were 3 meetings with lawyers before the contract was signed. Attorneys he'd never met before who worked out of offices that smelled like old money and very serious decisions. The document was 41 pages. He read every word, not because he distrusted the terms, but because signing 41 pages of something without reading it was how people ended up in terrible situations, and he had Mia to consider. The terms were exactly what she'd described. Duration, compensation, medical coverage, living arrangements, public obligations, exit conditions. There was a clause about what happened if either party developed romantic feelings, not that it would invalidate the contract, just that it had to be disclosed and managed separately. He'd read that clause 3 times, not sure whether to find it cynical or practical, and decided it was probably both. He signed on a Wednesday afternoon. Victoria signed across the table from him, efficient and immediate, and then her attorney took the documents, and Logan's attorney took his copies, and Victoria looked up and said, "Thank you, Logan." First name. First time. He nodded. "When do we start?" "Saturday," she said. "I'll have my assistant coordinate the details." He went home, made dinner, helped Mia with a school project about ecosystems, watched half a movie she'd been wanting to see until she fell asleep on the couch, and he carried her to bed and stood in her doorway again with the specific feeling of someone standing at the edge of a decision they couldn't take back. He'd made his choice. He'd made it looking at a foreclosure letter and a child asleep with her stuffed rabbit and a stack of medical bills that had been eating him alive for over a year. He didn't regret it, not yet. But he was honest enough with himself to know that the thing he felt standing in that doorway wasn't confidence. It was something closer to the sensation of stepping off a curb in the dark and not being sure yet how far the ground was. He went to bed. Saturday was coming. Saturday arrived gray and cold, the kind of morning that felt like the city hadn't fully decided to wake up yet. Logan had packed 2 bags, one for himself, one for Mia, and spent most of Friday night second-guessing the ratio of practical versus sentimental items before telling himself he was overthinking a logistics problem and just finishing the job. Mia had packed her own bag with minimal input from him, which meant it contained 4 stuffed animals, 1 pair of socks, her favorite hoodie, and a library book that was due back in 3 days. "You need actual clothes," he'd told her. "I have the hoodie." For multiple days. She'd looked at him with the patient expression of someone who found adult priorities baffling. Fine. She'd added 2 shirts and a pair of leggings without enthusiasm, then zipped the bag before he could inspect it further. The car Victoria sent arrived at 8. Not a limo. Just a black sedan, clean and unremarkable, driven by a man named David, who said good morning and loaded the bags without commentary. Mia pressed her nose against the window the entire ride and asked questions Logan didn't always have answers to. Where are we going exactly? Is it tall? Does she have a dog? Why doesn't she have a dog? Would she get a dog if we asked? We are not asking her to get a dog, Logan said. I'm just asking if we could ask. We can't. That seems like a rule you made up right now. He looked at the window. It is. The building was tall. Of course it was. It occupied a corner block in one of the quieter residential neighborhoods in the city's upper district. Not a penthouse in the conventional sense, but a private floor in a converted architectural landmark, the kind of building that had been a bank or a courthouse in a previous century and had been renovated into residential space with the original bones intact. High ceilings, stone detailing on the exterior, windows that were almost embarrassingly large. Mia's response to the lobby was a single, slow "oh." Logan felt something similar, but kept it internal. The elevator opened directly into the apartment, a foyer with dark hardwood floors and walls the color of old paper. Real art hung at considered intervals. A console table with a single lamp and a stack of books that looked like they'd actually been read. Not a showroom. A place where someone lived, even if they lived very deliberately. Victoria was in the kitchen when they arrived, not staged waiting. Actually in the kitchen, in a gray sweater and dark pants with her hair down for the first time Logan had seen, holding a coffee mug and frowning at something on her phone. She looked up when they came in, and the frown cleared into something more neutral, and she said, "You found it." "Your driver knew where it was," Logan said. "Good." She set the phone down and looked at Mia with the slightly uncertain expression of someone who was competent at most things, but was genuinely unsure how to calibrate for an 8-year-old. "Hi." Mia studied her with the unfiltered assessment that children performed openly and adults had learned to disguise. "You have really big windows," she said finally. Something shifted at the corner of Victoria's mouth. "I do." "Can I look out of one?" "Mia," Logan started. "Yes," Victoria said. "The ones in the living room face east. You can see the bridge on a clear day." Mia took this information with gravity and walked toward the living room without waiting for further permission. Logan watched her go, then looked at Victoria. "She's direct," Victoria said. "She's 8. They're all direct." "I wouldn't know." She said it without self-pity, just flatly, as a fact. She picked up her mug again. "Coffee?" "Please." The first week was awkward in the way that all new living arrangements were awkward. The negotiation of shared space, the discovery of small incompatibilities, the specific discomfort of being around someone you didn't know well enough for silence to feel comfortable. Victoria was in her home office by 7 every morning and rarely emerged before noon. She worked the way some people ran long distances, with a focused, almost punishing consistency that suggested she either genuinely loved it or had made peace with the fact that it was who she was. Logan kept his hours on his own department's schedule, working remotely 3 days a week per the arrangement they'd agreed on, going into the office the other 2. He cooked, because it turned out that Victoria's refrigerator contained mostly protein bars, sparkling water, and 3 types of expensive mustard. She didn't apologize for this. She just said, "I eat at the office a lot. I haven't needed to keep the kitchen stocked." "You have a kitchen the size of my old apartment," Logan said, looking at it. "That didn't seem relevant before." Right. So he started cooking, not out of any domestic impulse, but because Mia needed real food on a regular schedule, and he was already cooking for her anyway, and making more of something was not meaningfully harder than making the exact right amount. The first time he set a plate at Victoria's end of the table without asking, she looked at it for a moment and then looked at him. "You don't have to." "It's pasta," he said. "I made too much." She sat down, ate it, said nothing for a while, and then said, "This is good. It's pasta." "I know what pasta is." A pause. "I just haven't had a meal cooked in this kitchen in approximately 2 years." He didn't know what to say to that, so he didn't say anything. Mia filled the silence by explaining the entire plot of the book she was reading, which ran for 11 minutes and required no contributions from either adult. The public part started in the second week. There was a charity event, Arts Foundation, black tie, the kind of thing where Victoria was expected to appear, and where appearing alone would have started the exact questions she was trying to prevent. Logan owned one tuxedo, purchased for a colleague's wedding 3 years ago and worn exactly once since. It still fit, which he considered a minor personal victory. The car ride to the venue was quiet. Mia was with Mrs. Calloway, who had responded to the news of the temporary arrangement with the philosophical acceptance of a woman who had seen a great deal and had decided to think well of people until proven otherwise. Victoria sat beside him in the back of the car in a dark green dress that was elegant without being ornamental. Her hair up, her posture the particular kind of straight that looked like it had been built into her skeletal structure rather than consciously maintained. She was looking at her phone. "You should put the phone away," Logan said. She glanced at him. "When we get out of the car," he clarified. "If you're checking emails while we walk in, it reads like you're uncomfortable." "I am uncomfortable." "I know, but they shouldn't be able to tell." She looked at him for a moment. Then she put the phone in her clutch. "Fine. Also," he hesitated. "What?" "We should probably figure out how we're going to stand, like physically, whether we hold hands, or arm in arm, or just..." He made a vague gesture. "Something that doesn't look like 2 people who met 3 weeks ago." Victoria looked at him with an expression he was starting to recognize, the one where she was processing something she hadn't anticipated needing to process. "You're more practically minded about this than I expected." "I have a kid with cancer. I've been practically minded about everything for 14 months. The words came out more direct than he'd intended. He saw something change in her expression, not pity, which he'd learned to recognize and resent, something closer to acknowledgement. "Arm in arm," she said, "for the entrance. We'll figure out the rest." The entrance went fine. Better than fine. There was a bank of photographers at the venue doors, the charitable foundation kind who took photographs for press releases rather than tabloids. And when Victoria stepped out of the car and Logan offered his arm, she took it without hesitation and walked forward with the particular confidence of someone who had been doing this her entire adult life. He matched her pace. Someone called her name, and she turned and smiled, and the camera clicked, and it looked, he thought, completely real. Inside, she introduced him as her partner to 7 different people in the first 20 minutes. Board members of the foundation, a city councilwoman, 2 other CEOs. Each introduction was delivered with the same tone, warm, precise, nothing oversold. He shook hands, said appropriate things, and watched the room behind her eyes while she navigated the social architecture of the event, with a fluency that was genuinely impressive. Around 10 o'clock, they found themselves briefly alone near the bar, and he said, "You're very good at this." "It's necessary," she said, looking at the room. "That's not the same as being good at it." She glanced at him sideways. "No," she said after a moment. "I suppose it isn't. He got them both water. She'd had one glass of wine and then switched. And he was following her lead partly out of genuine preference and partly because he was aware they needed to be coherent. And they stood together in a quiet pocket of the event, not talking, watching other people talk. It was surprisingly not uncomfortable. The silence between them had been slowly, incrementally becoming a different shape over the past 2 weeks. Less like the silence of strangers and more like the silence of people who had run out of performing at each other. "Can I ask you something?" he said. "You can ask?" "The investors, the ones who put the clause in. Why haven't you just fought it legally? 41-page contracts have gaps. My lawyers have been working on it for 4 months. Her voice was level. "The clause is airtight. Whoever drafted it knew exactly what they were building. If we challenged it in court, the proceeding would take 18 months minimum, and during that time the poison pill is active, which means they could trigger the board action before any judgment." She paused. This was not sloppiness on their part. This was architecture. "So someone planned this?" "Yes. From the beginning. Probably from before I signed the term sheet." She said it without heat, but the stillness in her voice had a weight to it. "I was expanding fast. I just lost my CFO to a stroke. My operations chief had taken a competing offer. I was running 3 major acquisitions simultaneously, and I was not as careful as I should have been. I trusted people I'd worked with for years, and I missed something I shouldn't have missed." A pause. "I don't make mistakes like that often. I made that one." He looked at her profile, the line of her jaw, the way she was watching the room without seeing it. "Is it someone in the company?" "I have a suspicion," she said. "Nothing provable yet." "Who?" She looked at him then, directly, and what he saw in her expression was the specific quality of someone who had been carrying something alone for a long time and wasn't sure yet whether to put it down. "A man named Gerald Marsh. He's been on the board for 6 years. He came in as a representative of one of the original investors. He's been expanding his influence steadily, and he's positioned to take operational control if the CEO seat opens." She turned back to the room. "But I can't prove it yet. And until I can, the safest thing I can do is eliminate the mechanism he's using." "The marriage clause." "Yes." Logan thought about the 41-page document he'd read and signed, and the single page of it that he'd read 3 times. "And when we're married," he said, "the clause is satisfied. He loses that lever." "That's the theory." "You seem uncertain about it." She looked at him again. "People like Gerald Marsh don't usually have only one plan." The party continued around them, the jazz quartet in the corner, the quiet social machinery of people who held power and used events like this to maintain it. Logan stood next to Victoria Sinclair in a venue he'd never been to before and thought about architecture, about plans within plans, about the specific kind of danger that didn't announce itself. "I want to know more," he said, "about the company records, the financial side." She frowned slightly. "Why?" "Because I'm a financial analyst," he said. "And if someone was building architecture into a term sheet, the structure would be visible in the numbers if you know where to look. I might be able to find something your lawyers haven't found yet." She was quiet for a moment. Then, "I'll have my assistant send you access to the relevant files." The access came through 2 days later. 47 folders of financial documentation, board minutes, investor communications, and transaction records going back 4 years. Logan opened them on a Tuesday night after Mia was in bed and worked until 2 in the morning, and then worked again the following evening and the one after that, building a map of the company's capital structure the way he built any analysis, slowly, systematically, following the money wherever it went. He didn't say anything to Victoria for the first week. He was still building the picture. What he could see at this early stage was that the company's financial architecture was legitimately complex, not unusual for a company of this scale, but complex in ways that seemed slightly in excess of operational necessity. Money moved between subsidiaries in patterns that were legal but not obvious. Certain investment vehicles appeared and disappeared across reporting periods. He flagged items, built a separate document of questions, and kept working. What he didn't expect was what happened on the Thursday of that same week. He was in the kitchen at 11 at night, Mia asleep, Victoria's office still showing a light under the door. With his laptop and a mug of cold coffee, working through a particularly dense set of subsidiary transfer records, when he heard footsteps in the hallway and looked up. Victoria came into the kitchen. She was still in work clothes, minus the blazer, and she looked the specific kind of tired that went deeper than physical. She opened the refrigerator, looked at it, closed it, opened a cabinet and took out a glass and filled it with water and stood at the counter drinking it, and then she registered him at the table and said, "You're still up." Clearly, she looked at the laptop. "The files?" "Yes." She came and sat down across from him, not looking at the screen, just sitting. The kitchen was quiet. Outside, several stories below, the city made its low background noise. "The board is calling an emergency review next month," she said. "Gerald's been circulating a narrative that my judgment has become erratic, that the expansion strategy represents irresponsible risk." She said it in the flat tone of someone reporting the weather. "He's been having conversations with board members individually, off the record." "How do you know?" "Because I have people he doesn't know I have." For the first time that evening, something dry and almost wry moved across her face. "He's not the only one who plans ahead." "Is the emergency review a problem?" "It depends on what he presents. If he brings numbers, even selectively presented numbers, to a room full of board members who are already anxious about the expansion, it could shift the vote." She looked at the table. "If he can call my competence into question before the marriage is formally registered, he can accelerate the timeline." Logan looked at her. "So we need to move faster." "The registration is scheduled for next week." "Public announcement?" "My PR team is handling the timing." She paused. "I told them to frame it as private, something we've kept quiet for personal reasons. That we want to keep the ceremony small." She looked at him with a slight ironess that he'd started to recognize as her version of self-conscious. "They found the story plausible." "Because it is plausible," he said. "Single father, private CEO. Neither of us is the type to make a big announcement." She considered this. "No, we're not." Something passed between them in the quiet kitchen. Not romantic, not loaded, just the specific acknowledgement of two people who had figured out, without ceremony, that they understood each other slightly better than either had expected to. "I found something in the files," Logan said. "Not enough to act on yet, but something." She straightened slightly. "There's a pattern in the subsidiary transfer records, 3 years ago through about 18 months ago. Money moving in small increments through a series of holding vehicles that don't seem operationally necessary. It could be tax positioning, but the timing correlates with something." He turned the laptop toward her and pointed at the column he'd highlighted. "The term sheet you signed was negotiated over 4 months. The transfer pattern starts approximately 2 months into that negotiation and stops about 3 weeks after you signed." Victoria looked at the screen. Her expression didn't change, but her stillness became a different kind. Focused, the way a person went still when they were processing something that mattered. "You think he was positioning assets," she said. "I think someone was. I can't tell you yet who or why, but the timing is not a coincidence." He pulled the laptop back. "I need 2 more weeks with the records, maybe 3. She looked at him, not with the boardroom quality she sometimes had, the distance, the assessment, but directly, one person to another. "Why are you doing this?" "Because you're paying me." "That's not why." He was quiet for a moment. Outside, the city hummed. In the room down the hall, his daughter was sleeping in a borrowed bed in a borrowed home, her stuffed rabbit under her arm, her blood counts holding steady at the last check, her hair growing back slowly from the last round of treatment. "Because I know what it looks like when someone's trying to take something from you," he said, "and I don't like watching it happen." Victoria held his gaze for a second, then she looked back at the table and said, 2 weeks. Tell me what you find." The wedding was on a Friday. A clerk's office. A witness each. Marcus for Logan, a woman named Diane, who was Victoria's oldest friend and who had arrived from out of town with the brisk competence of someone who had been given a job and intended to do it properly. The ceremony took 11 minutes. Logan wore his regular suit. Victoria wore a charcoal dress she might have worn to any business meeting, which was, he'd come to understand, her version of making peace with something. Mia was there. He hadn't planned it. It felt wrong to drag her into the legal machinery of something she didn't fully understand, but Mia had found out about the appointment through the simple mechanism of overhearing a phone call, and she had appeared in the kitchen doorway with her arms folded and said, "You're getting married and you weren't going to tell me?" "It's—" He stopped. "It's complicated. I want to come." "Mia, I want to come, she said again, not pleading, just stating. She makes you eat dinner. She got me the good math workbook when I said I was bored. I want to be there. He had looked at her for a long moment. His daughter, who at 8 had learned more about how the world actually worked than he'd ever wanted her to, and said, okay. So Mia was there. She stood beside Logan in the clerk's office in her school clothes and her serious expression and held his hand during the brief formalities. When the clerk pronounced them legally married and Logan turned to find something to do with his hands, Mia looked up at Victoria and said, "You're not going to cry?" Victoria looked down at her. "No. My dad looks like he might." "I'm not crying," Logan said. "Your eyes are—" "Mia!" Victoria made a sound. It took him a moment to identify it as a laugh. A real one, short and slightly surprised, like it had happened before she could organize it. The first genuine laugh he'd heard from her. It changed her face entirely, briefly, into something younger and less composed and considerably more real. Mia looked pleased with herself. They went to a diner afterward. Not a restaurant, a diner. Because Mia said diners were better for celebrations because they had milkshakes. Victoria sat across from them in a vinyl booth in her charcoal dress with a chocolate milkshake in front of her and looked at it for a moment. "I haven't had one of these since I was probably her age," she said. "Are they still good?" Mia asked. Victoria took a sip, considered it with the same precision she applied to financial projections. "Yes," she said. "They're still good." Mia nodded, satisfied, and went back to her own. Logan watched them both. The tick of something was happening, something he hadn't budgeted for, hadn't included in the contract or the terms or any of the analysis he'd done on that kitchen table at 2 in the morning. Something that didn't have a clean name yet, but was real and growing, and was beginning to change the shape of everything. He picked up his coffee, looked out the diner window at the gray afternoon city. He'd agreed to a transaction, a practical arrangement between two people with specific and compatible needs. He was increasingly, unsettlingly aware that something else was also happening, something he hadn't asked for and hadn't been prepared for and wasn't sure what to do with. He drank his coffee and said nothing. Some things had to be thought about carefully before you knew what they were. The weeks after the clerk's office had a different quality than the ones before it. Not easier, exactly, but different. The apartment that had felt borrowed and slightly too large began to organize itself around 3 people instead of 1. And that reorganization happened the way most real things happened. Not through any single moment, but through accumulation. Mia's drawings appearing on the refrigerator that had previously held only Victoria's dry cleaning receipts and a takeout menu she'd never used. The kitchen counter developing a permanent population of Mia's school things. The particular sound of the apartment at 7 in the morning shifting from the quiet of one person moving through space to something with more texture. Cereal bowls, a cartoon on low volume, Mia's running narration of whatever she was thinking about. Victoria adjusted to it with the same methodical pragmatism she applied to everything else, which meant she was initially slightly stilted about it, and then, gradually, less so. She started setting her alarm 15 minutes earlier, which Logan only discovered when he came into the kitchen one morning to find her already there, reading something on her tablet, a second mug of coffee waiting on the counter. "You don't have to do that," he said. "Do what?" He gestured at the mug. "I was already making it," she said, and looked back at her tablet, and that was the end of that conversation. Mia had no adjustment period whatsoever. She'd decided on day 1 that Victoria was interesting and potentially useful. She'd helped Mia with a geometry worksheet in the second week, with an efficiency that had genuinely impressed an 8-year-old who had very high standards for competence. And from there it was simply a matter of time before Mia treated her like a fixture. She knocked on Victoria's office door with questions. She showed her things. She reported the day's events at dinner with the full expectation that Victoria was as invested in the outcome of the 4th grade science project as anyone else at the table. Logan watched it happen and didn't know what to do with the feeling it produced. Something between gratitude and a specific kind of grief he couldn't quite name. The grief for things your child shouldn't have had to do without, that you hadn't been able to give them, appearing suddenly and being given by someone unexpected. He pushed the feeling somewhere practical and kept working. The files had given him something. 3 weeks into his access, working most evenings after Mia was in bed, he'd assembled a picture that was incomplete but coherent enough to be significant. The subsidiary transfer pattern he'd found initially was one piece. The second piece was a series of related party transactions between Sinclair Capital's secondary investment vehicle and a holding company that appeared in the records under a name he didn't recognize, Delvane Partners, which, when he ran it through the business registry databases he had access to, connected to a shell entity registered in a state with minimal disclosure requirements. He brought it to Victoria on a Wednesday evening, spread the printed documents across the kitchen table, and walked her through it the way he walked clients through financial analysis. Structured, sequential, no editorializing until the end. She listened without interrupting, read what he pointed to, asked two precise questions. Then she sat back and looked at the table. Delvane, she said, you recognize it? Gerald Marsh's wife's maiden name is Delvane. Her voice was quiet, the specific quiet of controlled anger. Her family name. He used her family name. Logan felt the particular satisfaction of a pattern completing itself, immediately followed by the colder feeling of understanding what it meant. He's been positioning assets through your own subsidiary structure, slowly, in small enough increments that it didn't flag in routine audits. He tapped the column he'd highlighted 3 weeks ago. The timeline matches the term sheet negotiation. I think he was building his exit infrastructure at the same time he was building the trap. He knew I'd fight it, she said. He planned for you to fight it. The clause, the timeline, the asset positioning, it's all designed to run you out of options before you can respond effectively. He looked at her. If I'm right about the Delvane connection, he has financial exposure, breach of fiduciary duty at minimum, potentially more depending on what the transactions were actually doing. Can you prove the connection? Not yet. The shell registration is clean, but there'll be a paper trail somewhere. There always is, with money. I need access to the board-level transaction approvals from 3.5 years ago. He paused. Which means I need access to records I don't currently have. Victoria was already reaching for her phone. Buck. March arrived, and with it the emergency board review Gerald had been building toward. Logan was not in the room. His role was still officially just senior financial analyst, and the board meeting was executive territory. But Victoria briefed him the night before with the specific efficiency of someone preparing for combat. Gerald had secured 3 board members who would support a motion to formally review her strategic decisions. He'd prepared a presentation. He had numbers, selectively presented, as she'd predicted, but numbers nonetheless. What's your counter? Logan asked. I have the Q4 results, which are strong. The expansion margins are holding. I have 2 board members who are solidly in my corner and 2 who are genuinely undecided. She was standing at the kitchen counter with her arms folded, not looking at anything in particular. If the undecideds hold, the motion fails. And if they don't? She was quiet. Victoria. If they shift to Gerald's side, the motion passes and we enter a formal review period during which his clause can be invoked. She looked at the counter. I'd have 30 days before they could call the CEO vote. That's enough time. It might be. She looked at him then. Or it might not. He held her gaze. There was something in her face in that moment that he'd seen only rarely. The cracks in the composure, the real thing underneath the architecture. Not weakness. Something more honest than that. The face of someone who had been fighting alone for a long time and was tired in a bone-deep way that didn't show up in any financial report. He wanted to say something useful. He was not a man who had easy words for moments like this. Sarah's illness had stripped that out of him somewhere in the first 6 months of hospitals and prognoses and learning to live inside uncertainty. But he was there, and she was there. And so he said, the board meeting is tomorrow at 10. Tonight you should eat something that isn't protein bars and sleep more than 5 hours. She stared at him. That's my contribution, he said. Something happened in her expression. The exhaustion shifted slightly, made room for something warmer, and she said, You're a very strange person. I've been told. She ate dinner. He didn't know whether she slept, but she walked out of the apartment at 8:45 the next morning in her best suit with her shoulders straight and her face composed, and he stood in the kitchen with his coffee and felt something he didn't have a contract clause for. She won the board vote. The motion failed 4-3. She came home at 6:30 that evening, set her bag down in the foyer, and stood there for a moment with her eyes closed. Logan was in the kitchen. Mia was at the table drawing something industrious. Neither of them spoke immediately, which was the right instinct. The moment needed a second of space. Then Mia looked up and said, Did you win? Victoria opened her eyes, looked at her. Yes. Mia nodded, satisfied, and went back to her drawing. Good, Dad said you would. Victoria looked at Logan. I said you probably would, he said. Same thing, Mia said, without looking up. Victoria looked at the drawing, then at the kitchen table, then at the two of them, and something crossed her face that she didn't manage to arrange quickly enough. Something real and slightly undone that was gone in a second, but had been there. She went to change out of her suit. Logan turned back to the stove and said nothing, but the feeling in his chest had a shape now. He still didn't have clean words for it, but it had a shape. The story broke on a Thursday. He was at his desk in the office, working through a client analysis, when Marcus appeared at his elbow with his phone already out, and his expression wrong. The expression of someone who'd stumbled onto something and wasn't sure how to handle it. Logan. 1 second. Logan, you need to look at this. He looked at the phone. The headline was from a financial news outlet, the kind with a broad readership and a reputation for investigative accuracy. His eyes moved across it once, and then moved across it again. Sinclair Capital CEO's surprise marriage, contract arrangement, or calculated deception. Below the headline, a photograph, him and Victoria, taken at the Charity Arts Foundation event 7 weeks ago, the one where he'd told her to put her phone away before they walked in. They were arm in arm, mid-step, both looking forward. It was a good photograph in the technical sense. It looked, without question, like a couple. Then there was a second photograph, a document. He recognized the format immediately because he had a copy of it in the drawer of his nightstand. The first page of the 41-page marriage contract, complete with both their signatures at the bottom. Oh, he said. Yeah, Marcus said. He was already reaching for his own phone. Victoria answered before it rang twice. I know. How bad? I'm still assessing. The contract page is authentic. It was leaked, not fabricated. Her voice was controlled in the way it got when something was actively on fire. My legal team is trying to determine the source. The story is running in 3 outlets so far, and will be in more by tonight. Who had access to the contract? My legal team. Your legal team. The 2 witnesses. A pause. And Gerald Marsh, who sits on the board's audit committee and has administrative access to certain legal filings. He leaked it. Almost certainly, but I can't prove it yet. What's the board's response? I've had 2 calls already. The undecided members from yesterday are now less undecided. The word came out flat and controlled and containing something underneath it. Gerald's office has already issued a statement expressing concern about the CEO's judgment and fitness. Logan stood up from his desk and walked toward the door of the open plan office, toward the corridor where he could talk without the ambient awareness of 30 other analysts. I'm coming home. You don't need to. Mia gets out of school at 3. I'll pick her up early. We're coming home. He didn't give her a chance to argue. We'll deal with the rest of it there. By 6 o'clock that evening, the story had spread. Not tabloid spread. Worse than that. Financial press, business news, the serious outlets that the investor class actually read. The framing was consistent across all of them. Embattled CEO enters secret contractual marriage. Questions mount about judgment and transparency. Several had found Logan's name and basic employment history. One had tracked down a 2-year-old photograph of him from a company event and run it alongside Victoria's professional headshot under the subheading, The Financial Analyst at the Center of the Story. He was sitting at the kitchen table with his laptop, tracking the spread, when Mia came and stood beside his chair. Is Victoria in trouble? She asked. He looked at her. It's complicated. People on the internet are being mean about her. He'd forgotten she could read news sites. She was 8, but she was 8 in the age of devices. Don't read the comments, Mia. I wasn't reading comments. I was reading the actual words. She looked at his screen. Is it because of you? Because you got married? Partly. She was quiet for a moment, then, that's not fair. No, he said, it isn't. Victoria was in her office. Had been since they got home, door closed, phone calls rolling through in sequence. Her PR team, her legal team, the 2 board members who were still in her corner. Logan had knocked once at 6:30, left a plate of food on the side table near the door, and said, eat it at some point. There had been a brief pause in the phone call she was on, and then her voice had said, thank you, and he'd gone back to the kitchen. At 8:30, After Mia was in bed, the office door opened. Victoria came out looking like someone who had run a marathon and then been told there was another one. The composure was still there. It was apparently structural, but there were lines around it, hairline fractures in the control. She came and sat at the kitchen table across from him without speaking. He waited. The board is calling an emergency session Monday, she said. Gerald's motion is back on the table, and this time he has the votes. The story gives him cover. He can frame it as a transparency issue, a concern about leadership integrity. She pressed her fingers to the side of her forehead briefly. He planned this, Logan. The board vote yesterday was designed to fail. He wanted me to win it. It made today's story land harder. Successful board vote one day, contractual marriage scandal the next. The juxtaposition is the point. Logan absorbed this. The architecture of it was, objectively, impressive in the way that only genuinely dangerous things were impressive. He's been working this for over a year, probably longer. She looked at the table. I built this company over 9 years. I was here 4 days after my father died because he would have wanted it. I have 3,800 employees. She said it not dramatically but quietly, the way people named things that mattered. He wants to take it for a financial position. That's all it is to him. We still have the Delvane connection, Logan said. It's not enough yet. I know, but it will be. He leaned forward. The board session is Monday. I need access to the audit records before then. The board-level approvals. Did your assistant get me what I asked for? It's in your shared folder. I approved the access this morning before everything. She stopped. Before. Okay. He opened his laptop. Go sleep. I can't sleep. Try anyway. He looked at her. You need to be functional for Monday. The PR, the board response, the legal strategy. That all requires you thinking clearly. Let me work on the numbers side tonight. She looked at him for a long moment. Why are you still here? The question was direct in the way hers always were, but there was something different underneath it. Something with more weight than the previous time she'd asked versions of it. Because we made a deal, he said. The deal is effectively broken. The contract is public. The arrangement has failed its primary purpose. She said it without accusation, just the straight logic of it. You could walk away. You and Mia. The terms have a contingency clause for public disclosure. He looked at her steadily. I know what the clause says. Then you know you have a clean exit. I know that, he said again. And I'm still here. Victoria looked at him. Something moved through her expression, complicated and real and not organized into anything she was ready to name. Go sleep, he said again, more quietly. I'll find something in the records. She went. He worked until 2 in the morning, and then until 3. The board-level approvals gave him the additional layer he'd needed. What he'd found before was suggestive. What he found now, cross-referencing the approval timestamps against the Delvane transactions and the investor communications, was architectural. The money trail wasn't just circumstantial. There were 2 specific transactions that had been approved through a board subcommittee process that Gerald chaired, routed through the Delvane vehicle, that didn't correspond to any legitimate operational need he could identify. The amounts were not enormous, which was probably intentional, large enough to be meaningful as positioning, small enough to stay below routine audit thresholds. But the timing was the key. Both transactions had occurred during the 4-month period when Gerald had been simultaneously serving on the investor advisory panel that reviewed the term sheet Victoria had signed. He had been, during that period, in a position of fiduciary trust to the company while simultaneously moving money through a vehicle he controlled. That was not tax positioning. That was fraud. Logan sat back and looked at the screen at 3:12 in the morning and felt the cold, specific satisfaction of a man who had found the number that changed the calculation. He printed everything, made a second copy, put one in his bag and one in the kitchen drawer behind the takeout menu that nobody ever used. Then he sat there in the quiet apartment with the city sounds coming in at low volume and let himself think about something other than numbers for approximately 90 seconds. The emergency board session was Monday. Gerald Marsh thought he'd won. He'd leaked the contract, triggered the scandal, moved the board votes into alignment. He'd spent over a year building this, and it had gone according to plan, and Monday he was going to walk into that room believing the company was already his. He didn't know about Delvane. He didn't know that a financial analyst who'd been hired as a prop in someone else's story had spent 3 weeks in the company's records and found the thread he'd tried to hide. Logan closed the laptop, turned off the kitchen light, stood in the dark apartment for a moment. Down the hall, Mia was asleep. In the other direction, behind a closed door, Victoria was... He didn't know if she was actually sleeping, but the apartment was quiet. He thought about the exit clause in the contract, the clean way out she'd offered him. He thought about Mia's voice saying that's not fair with the uncomplicated moral certainty of a child who understood fairness as a real thing, not a theoretical one. He thought about 9 years, about 3,800 employees, about a company someone had tried to steal one clause at a time. He went to bed. He had a board meeting to prepare for. The weekend was its own kind of difficult. The story was still circulating. Logan's phone had rung twice from numbers he didn't recognize, journalists, presumably, and he'd declined both. Marcus had texted, "Okay, so you're actually married to the CEO? I feel like you buried the lead on this one." He'd responded, "It's complicated." Marcus had sent back a single emoji of a man shrugging, which was probably the correct response. On Saturday afternoon, Mia came to find him in the study where he was working and said, with the directness that was her primary mode, "Victoria's crying." He looked up. "What?" "In her room. I knocked to ask about the park, and she said she was fine, but her voice was the kind of fine that isn't fine." Logan set down the paper he was holding. He knocked on Victoria's door. A pause, and then, "I'm on a call." "Mia says you're not on a call." A longer pause. Then the door opened. She wasn't visibly crying. The evidence was retroactive, the slight redness around her eyes, the particular quality of someone who had recently stopped and composed themselves. She was in weekend clothes, no armor, which somehow made the composure more expensive looking rather than less. "I'm fine," she said. "Sure," he said, because arguing with that sentence never worked, in his experience. "What happened?" She looked at the doorframe for a moment. "The Arts Foundation board called. They've asked me to step back from my role on the committee until the situation is resolved." A pause. "Pending an internal review of whether my association creates reputational risk." She said it carefully and evenly. "I've been on that committee for 4 years. I helped rebuild their endowment." He didn't say anything immediately. He knew what that kind of loss felt like. Not the thing itself, but the signal it carried. The sense of something you'd built being quietly handed back to you. "That's Gerald too," he said. "Probably." "It won't hold." "Logan, it won't hold," he said again, more quietly. "Because Monday the board is going to hear something that changes the whole picture. I found what I needed Friday night." She looked at him. "You're certain?" "Enough to present it." She held his gaze for a second. There was something in her eyes that he recognized. Not hope exactly, which was too big a word for where they were, but something adjacent. Something that had been surviving on very little for a long time and recognized what it felt like to get slightly more. "Okay," she said. "Okay," he said back. Behind him in the hallway, Mia appeared with her jacket already on. "Are we going to the park or not?" They went to the park, all 3 of them, in the gray March afternoon, and Logan pushed Mia on the swings, and Victoria sat on the bench nearby with her hands in her pockets, and her face turned up toward the pale sky, and she looked, not peaceful, exactly, but like someone who had put something down for a few hours, which was probably all you could ask for. Monday was coming, and this time Logan intended to be ready for it. Sunday night, Logan didn't sleep. Not in the anxious, spinning way, more in the way of someone who had made a decision and was simply waiting for the moment to arrive. He lay in the dark for 2 hours, then gave up pretending and went to the kitchen at 1:15 and sat with his printed documents and a cup of coffee and went through everything one more time. Not because he'd missed anything, because he needed to know it cold, the way you needed to know certain things cold before you walked into a room where someone was going to try to take it apart. The Delvane connection was solid. The transaction timestamps were solid. The cross-reference between Gerald's advisory panel role and the board approval signatures was solid. What he had was not a theory, it was a sequence, money moving through channels. Gerald controlled, during a period when Gerald had fiduciary obligations that explicitly prohibited exactly that kind of self-interested positioning, approved through a subcommittee process that Gerald chaired, timed to coincide with the construction of the legal trap he'd set for Victoria. A financial forensics expert could spend 3 months building a cleaner version of this. Logan had 3 weeks and the particular clarity that came from having very little left to lose. He clipped the documents in the order he'd present them, put the stack in his bag, washed his coffee mug because old habits, and stood at the kitchen window looking at the city at 2 in the morning, the lights still on in 100 buildings for 100 different reasons, the bridge in the middle distance, the sky, the particular non-color of an urban night. He thought about Sarah briefly. Not the way he usually thought about her, the absence, the specific shape of what wasn't there, but more directly. The version of himself that had stood at a different window in a different apartment at 2 in the morning. Learning to understand that some things couldn't be fixed with effort and intelligence and sheer refusal to accept the outcome. This wasn't that. This was fixable. He had the tool in his bag. He went back to bed. Lay in the dark. At some point, the dark started getting lighter, and then his alarm went off at 6, and it was Monday. So Victoria was already up. She was in the kitchen in her board meeting suit. The one he'd come to understand was her armor, the dark charcoal with the clean lines that said, "I am the person who makes decisions in this room," with her hair done and her coffee in hand, reading something on her tablet. She looked up when he came in. "How long have you been up?" he asked. "A while." "Did you sleep at all?" "Some." She set the tablet down, looked at him. "You?" "Some." He poured coffee. "How are you reading the room going in?" "Gerald has the 4 votes he needed. My 2 are solid." She said it with the flat precision of a general counting troops. The undecided shifted after Thursday's story. That gives him the motion. Unless something changes the parameters. She looked at him. "Logan, what you found, it's significant, I believe that. But presenting financial evidence at a board meeting without prior notice, without a forensic accountant to validate, without legal preparation, I know." He sat down across from her. "It won't be a criminal proceeding, it'll be a board meeting. What I need to do is change the conversation, introduce enough credible doubt that the undecideds hesitate, buy us time to bring in the forensics." He looked at her. "Can your lawyer be in the room?" "Anne is already coming." "Good. I'll need 5 minutes, 10 at the outside." She looked at him for a long moment. He knew what she was doing, running the scenarios, calculating the risk of this going wrong against the risk of it going right. The particular calculus of someone who had spent 9 years making decisions where the margin for error was very thin. "The board secretary will try to block a non-member from presenting," she said. "You're the CEO. You control the agenda. Technically, in a session called under a review motion, Gerald controls the agenda. Then I'm coming as your technical advisor." He held her gaze. "Put me on the visitor list. If Gerald objects, he objects in front of a room full of board members, and the objection itself will look like someone who doesn't want a certain set of numbers examined." Something moved in her expression, the careful, controlled face cracking slightly at its edges, not into weakness, but into something that was the opposite of it. "Okay," she said. "Okay." They sat together at the kitchen table for a few minutes, not talking, just drinking their coffee in the gray morning light. Down the hall, Mia was still asleep. She had school, a normal Tuesday in her normal world, Mrs. Calloway picking her up at 3. The ordinary machinery of a child's life continuing alongside whatever this was. At 7:40, Victoria stood, straightened her jacket, picked up her bag. "Logan," she said. He looked at her. She seemed like she was going to say something, then reconsidered it, and what she said instead was, "Thank you for the work you did this week." "Don't thank me yet," he said. "Thank me after." The Sinclair Capital Board met on the 38th floor in a conference room that had a long table, expensive chairs, and windows looking out over the financial district at 9 in the morning. Logan had never been in this room. He sat in one of the chairs along the wall, the visitor chairs, the ones that weren't at the main table, with his bag in his lap and watched people file in. He knew the faces from the research he'd done. The 2 board members who were solidly Victoria's, a woman named Patricia Hoang, who'd been on the board for 6 years and had the demeanor of someone who had been correct about a great many things and had stopped feeling the need to announce it, and a man named David Osei, who was 62 and had known Victoria's father and showed it in the way he held himself when she walked into the room. The undecideds were less certain looking. A man named Hargrove, who kept his face carefully neutral, and a woman named Caldwell, who sat with her hands folded on the table and looked at nothing in particular. Gerald Marsh came in last. Logan had not met him before. In person, Gerald was 61, heavy-set in the way of a man who had once been athletic and had stopped caring about that, with a face that had settled into an expression of permanent mild authority, the face of someone accustomed to rooms deferring to him. He sat at the head of the table with the ease of someone claiming space he considered already his, and he glanced once at Logan in the visitor chairs and registered him with a look that was, Logan thought, faintly contemptuous. A prop, a supporting character in someone else's story. That look helped. It made what Logan was about to do feel clean. The session opened with procedural formalities. Gerald introduced the motion, review of the CEO's strategic judgment and fitness, framed around the disclosure failures of the marriage arrangement, and a selective presentation of the expansion strategy's debt load projections. He was smooth and measured and delivered the case with the fluency of someone who had rehearsed it until it felt like reasoning instead of construction. Victoria responded. Methodically, without visible emotion, she addressed each point: the expansion margins, the Q4 results, the compliance structure of the marriage arrangement, and the specific legal context in which it had been formed. She was good. She was very good, and Logan, sitting against the wall, had a moment of absolute understanding that she had been fighting this alone for over a year. But the room wasn't moving. He could feel it. The particular quality of a conversation where the conclusion has already been reached and the words are performance. Hargrove's face stayed neutral. Caldwell's hands stayed folded. Gerald called for the vote at 10:47. Victoria's lawyer, Anne, immediately stood and requested a point of clarification regarding the fiduciary context of the review motion, which bought approximately 90 seconds. Logan was already standing. "Mr. Marsh," he said. The room looked at him. Gerald turned with the expression of someone dealing with an interruption they hadn't anticipated. "You are—" Gerald started. "Logan Hayes. I'm a senior financial analyst at this company, and I'm here in an advisory capacity to the CEO." He kept his voice level and professional, not aggressive, just present. "Before the vote, I'd like to present a brief financial analysis that I believe is material to the board's deliberations. This session's agenda doesn't include—" "Gerald!" Patricia Hoying's voice, quiet and precise, cut across the objection. "Let him speak." Gerald looked at her. A calculation ran behind his eyes. He spread his hands in the gesture of a man granting a minor concession with magnanimity. Logan pulled his documents out and walked to the presentation screen at the end of the room. He'd gotten access to the display setup from Victoria's assistant at 7 that morning. He put the first slide up. The Delvane transaction records. The timeline column highlighted in yellow. "What I'm showing you," he said, "is a series of financial transactions executed through a holding vehicle called Delvane Partners, routed through Sinclair Capital's secondary investment subsidiary over a period of approximately 7 months beginning 3.5 years ago." The room was very quiet. He moved through it methodically, transaction by transaction. The timeline overlaid against the term sheet negotiation, the board subcommittee approvals, and the name on the approval authority. Gerald's face had done something. Not outwardly dramatic. He wasn't a man who gave much away. But something had gone still in him in a specific way. The stillness of someone who has just seen the evidence they thought was buried appear on a screen in a room full of people they were trying to impress. "The Delvane vehicle," Logan continued, "is connected to a shell entity whose registration traces to a family name directly associated with a current board member. The transactions I'm showing you occurred during a period when that board member was simultaneously serving on the investor advisory panel that reviewed and approved the term sheet Ms. Sinclair signed, including the personal clause that's now being used as a pretext for this motion." He paused. Let the room sit with that. That's not a coincidence of timing. That's a conflict of interest at minimum. And the structure of the transaction suggests it may be considerably more than that. He put the final slide up. The cross-reference. All of it on one page. "I want to be clear," he said. "I'm a financial analyst, not a forensic accountant. What I've built here is a framework that requires proper forensic examination to validate. What I'm asking this board to do is not render a legal judgment. I'm asking you to recognize that the motion currently on the table is being brought by someone who has potential financial exposure in these records, and to consider what it would mean to vote on it before those records have been examined." He looked at the room, at Hargrove, whose face had stopped being neutral, at Caldwell, who had unfolded her hands, at Gerald, who was sitting very still. "That's all I have," Logan said, and returned to his chair. The vote didn't happen that day. Patricia Hoying moved to table the motion pending a third-party financial review of the records Logan had presented. Osei seconded it immediately. Hargrove, after a silence that ran about 12 seconds and felt much longer, said he supported the motion to table. Caldwell followed. The motion failed to proceed. 4-2. Gerald Marsh left the room without speaking to anyone. His lawyer, who Logan hadn't noticed in the visitor chairs before, followed him out, looking like a man who needed to make several phone calls. Victoria sat at the head of the table after the room had mostly cleared. Anne was at her shoulder, already talking logistics, the forensic accountant, the timeline, the board communication strategy. Victoria was listening and nodding and looked from a distance exactly like the CEO of a $100 million company conducting business. Logan sat against the wall with his empty bag and let the adrenaline work its way through his system. Patricia Hoying stopped beside him on her way out. She looked at him for a moment, not warmly exactly, but directly, with the specific quality of a person giving something its correct weight. "Good work," she said. "Thank you." She left. Victoria crossed the room, sat in the chair next to him. Not the CEO posture, just a person, slightly deflated from the inside, the armor doing its job but at a cost. She didn't say anything for a moment. "Anne needs 20 minutes, she said finally. "And then I have 6 calls." "Okay." "The forensic examination will take time." "I know." "Gerald will lawyer up. This won't be clean or fast." "I know that too." She looked at him. Her face was composed, but composition had become a different thing since he'd known her. Not a wall, but a choice. He could see the difference now. "You didn't have to be in that room." "I know. I mean it, Logan. You didn't have to. The contract, the exit clause, the way this whole thing is gone." She stopped, started again. "I didn't expect you to do any of this." "I know you didn't." He looked at her. "That's not why I did it." She held his gaze for a moment. Something was working in her expression, something that had been working for weeks actually, building slowly under the surface of the practical and the contractual, and the arrangement and all the language they'd used to keep it categorized and contained. He could see it now clearly, and he had a feeling she could see something similar in his face, and neither of them said it yet because the boardroom wasn't the right place, and Anne was going to come back in 3 minutes. "Go do your calls," he said. She nodded, stood, straightened her jacket. "Logan?" She said his name quietly, standing at the door. He looked at her. "When this is over," she said, "when the forensics come back and the board situation is resolved and the legal process is wherever it lands." She paused. "I want to have a different conversation." He understood exactly what she meant. "Okay." She left. He sat in the empty boardroom for a minute, looking at the city through the tall windows, at the ordinary Monday morning of a city that hadn't known or cared what had just happened in this room. He thought about the conversation they hadn't had yet, about contracts and arrangements and the clauses nobody built in for this. The parts that happened sideways while you were looking at numbers, the parts that didn't fit in a document. He was going to pick up Mia at 3. She'd want to know how it went. He'd tell her it went well, and she'd say I knew it in the voice she used for things she'd predicted correctly, and Mrs. Calloway would have given her a snack and asked 0 questions out of a politeness Logan genuinely appreciated. He'd make dinner tonight, something real, not takeout. The 3 of them at the kitchen table. He picked up his bag, walked out. The forensic accounting firm came in the following week. They were thorough and expensive and moved through the records with the specific, unhurried efficiency of people who did this professionally and knew that precision mattered more than speed. Logan gave them everything he'd built, the full framework, the annotated documents, the cross-reference analysis, and they took it without fanfare and got to work. Gerald Marsh had retained a litigation team by Thursday. His lawyers sent a letter to Victoria's legal team that was 14 pages long and contested the admissibility of the financial presentation on grounds that shifted between procedural objection and defamation claim, which Anne had described as a letter from people who know their client is exposed and are trying to find the exit. She'd said it with the dry satisfaction of someone who'd read 1,000 of those letters. The board issued a statement of support for Victoria's continued leadership pending the review, which was lawyerly and careful, but which, in the language boards used, was significant. Hargrove had called Victoria directly. She'd told Logan about it, briefly, and said that the presentation had raised concerns he felt obligated to take seriously. It was the kind of understatement that meant something. The legal process would be long. The forensic review would generate a report that would need to be reviewed and contested and responded to through proper channels. Gerald was not going to disappear quietly. Men like Gerald rarely did. But the architecture he'd built had a crack in it now. And cracks, Logan knew from both personal and professional experience, had a way of becoming something larger once they started. 3 weeks after the board meeting, on a Thursday evening, Victoria knocked on the door of the small study he'd been using as a home office. I was at his desk. Looked up. She was in her weekend clothes, the off-duty version of her that he'd gotten used to, and that still occasionally caught him slightly off guard, the way it changed the angles of her face. She was holding 2 glasses, one in each hand, and she said, "Do you have a minute?" "Yes." She came in, set a glass on the corner of his desk, and took the armchair across from it, the one Mia used when she came in to tell him things, which meant the chair had approximately 4 stuffed animals worth of wear on the left armrest. They sat for a moment. The apartment was quiet. Mia was asleep, the city doing its low background hum. "The forensic report comes back next week," Victoria said. "I know. Anne says it's comprehensive. The Delvane connection holds." She looked at her glass. "Gerald's lawyers have been in contact about a possible settlement arrangement. He's looking for a way to exit quietly." "That's his right. Anne wants to push for the full criminal referral." "What do you want?" She was quiet. "I want him out of this company permanently, and I want the record to show what he did." She looked at Logan. "Whether that means a settlement with conditions or a criminal proceeding, I don't particularly care. I just want it to be real." "It'll be real either way," he said. She nodded slowly, looked at her glass again, then back at him, and something in her expression had shifted into the register of someone who had been moving toward a thing for a long time and had finally arrived at it. "I want to talk about us," she said. He didn't pretend not to understand. "Okay." The contract is a document," he said. "It doesn't have anything to do with what I'm about to say." She looked at him. "I'm not here because of the contract," he said. "I haven't been here because of the contract for a long time. I don't know exactly when that changed, but it changed, and I think you know that, and I think you've been waiting for me to say it out loud." He looked at her. "So I'm saying it." The room was very quiet. Victoria set her glass down on the side table. She looked at her hands for a moment, then looked at him with the directness that was the most fundamental thing about her, the quality that had been there in the boardroom at 9 a.m. 6 weeks after they'd met and had not changed once in everything that had happened since. "I don't know how to do this," she said. "The relationship part. I'm not good at it. I've been bad at it my whole adult life, and I'm aware of that. I know. I'm going to be difficult. I work too much and I go quiet when I'm stressed, and I don't always say what I'm feeling in a reasonable amount of time." "Victoria, I know," he said again, more gently. "I have an 8-year-old who's had leukemia, and I haven't fully dealt with my own grief in 3 years, and I make decisions with a spreadsheet when I'm scared. We're both a mess." He looked at her. "That's fine." She looked at him for a long moment. And then something happened in her face. Not the laugh this time, something quieter than that. Something that was both more settled and more exposed, like a building after a storm, still standing, the weather finally over. "Okay," she said. "Okay." It wasn't a dramatic moment. There was no musical score, no rain on the windows, no speech that wrapped everything into language. They were 2 tired people in a study at 10:30 on a Thursday night, and the thing between them had been building for months through boardrooms and kitchen tables and park benches and 2 a.m. document reviews and a diner booth with chocolate milkshakes. It didn't need a performance. He reached across the desk and took her hand. She let him. Her hand was cold. It was always slightly cold, he'd noticed. And she turned it over and held his back with the firm, deliberate grip of someone who, when they decided on something, decided completely. They sat like that for a while. Down the hall, Mia slept soundly in the room that had become her room, in the home that had become their home, in the life that had stopped being an arrangement somewhere along the way and had simply become real. Outside, the city went on, indifferent, loud, full of 1,000 other stories. In this particular apartment, in this particular quiet, something had settled into place. Not perfectly. Nothing worth having was perfect. There was still a legal process to get through, a company to stabilize, a child's medical treatment to see to its end, years of individual damage to navigate carefully and honestly. There were things about both of them that were going to be hard, that were going to require patience and effort and the willingness to say, I don't know how to do this, but I'm trying. But the foundation was real. It had been built without anyone fully planning it, out of documents and dinners and a joke at a company party and a woman who didn't laugh and a man who had decided to stop running. That was enough to build on. Logan looked at the window, at the city lights in the dark. He thought about his daughter asleep down the hall, her blood counts holding, her hair fully grown back, her laugh back in full volume. He thought about the person sitting across from him who had built something from nothing and fought to keep it with everything she had. He thought about how strange it was, how genuinely, specifically strange, that a joke at a party had led to this room, this hand, this life that had remade itself around him without asking permission. Strange and real, and worth every hard thing it had cost to get here. The forensic report came back on a Tuesday. Logan was at his desk when Victoria forwarded it. No message, just the attachment, which he understood meant she'd already read it and needed him to read it too before they talked. He opened it, worked through it over the next 2 hours with the same methodical patience he'd brought to the original records, but this time the picture was complete. Professional, validated, footnoted. 83 pages that said, in the precise language of financial forensics, exactly what Logan had found in the kitchen at 3 in the morning. Gerald Marsh had executed a systematic program of self-interested transactions through a vehicle he controlled during a period of explicit fiduciary obligation to Sinclair Capital, timed and structured to support his long-term plan to destabilize Victoria's position and acquire operational control of the company. Not theory. Documented fact. He closed the report and sat for a moment looking at his desk. 2 coffee mugs, both empty. A framed photo of Mia that she'd put there herself. So you don't forget what I look like while you're working, Daddy. Taken on a beach trip 2 summers ago, before the diagnosis, her hair loose and her mouth open mid-laugh. He looked at it the way he always looked at it when he needed to remember what the math was actually for. Then he went to find Victoria. She was in her office, standing at the window rather than sitting at her desk, which he'd learned was what she did when she was processing something instead of working. The desk was for action, the window was for thought. She heard him come in and turned. You read it, she said. Yes. Anne wants to proceed with the full criminal referral. She's been waiting for this report. Victoria looked at him. I've decided to support it. Good, good. It means a longer process. It means Gerald's lawyers will make noise for months. She turned back to the window briefly, then back to him. It also means the record is complete. What he did gets named properly, not buried in a settlement agreement with a confidentiality clause. That's the right call, Logan said. I know. She said it without arrogance, just the clean certainty of someone who'd thought it through and landed somewhere she could stand behind. The board voted this morning to formally support the referral. Patricia called me after to say it was unanimous. Even Hargrove? Even Hargrove. Something dry moved across her mouth. Apparently evidence of fraud changes people's positions. He almost smiled. Remarkable. Isn't it? She looked at him. There's something else. The board also passed a motion to formally acknowledge the circumstances of the marriage arrangement, the investor clause, the coercion mechanism, the full context. Anne drafted the language. It goes into the official company record. She paused. It matters for the legal process. It also matters because it's true, and the record should say what's true. He nodded. Which means, she continued, that the arrangement is formally on record as what it was. A defensive measure taken under duress, structured contractually, not a deception of the board or shareholders. She held his gaze. The story was never really about the contract. The story was about what Gerald wanted people to think the contract meant, and now the record says differently. Yes. They stood in the office for a moment. Outside the window, the city did what the city always did. Indifferent, moving, full of its own concerns. Logan thought about the news story from 2 months ago. The photograph of the two of them arm in arm outside the Arts Foundation, the headline that had made him feel briefly like a character in someone else's narrative, the financial analyst at the center of the story. He thought about how that had felt, and about how much had changed, and about the specific way things changed when you stopped running from them. "Come home early tonight," he said. She looked at him. "Mia's been working on something for a week and she won't tell me what it is. She keeps making me leave the kitchen." He looked at Victoria. "I think it's for you." Something happened in Victoria's expression that she didn't manage and didn't try to. "What is it?" "I genuinely don't know." She told me it was a surprise and then looked at me in a way that suggested I should not press further. Victoria looked out the window. "I'll be home by 6. She was home by 5:45, which Logan noted without comment, and which Mia registered immediately by appearing in the foyer with flour on her shirt and the particular expression of a child who has been waiting for an audience. "You're early," Mia said to Victoria. "Traffic was light." Mia assessed this. "Okay, come to the kitchen, but Dad has to stay in the living room." "Why does Dad have to stay in the living room?" Logan asked. "Because you already know what cake looks like." "That doesn't—" "Living room, please." He went to the living room, sat on the couch, listened to the kitchen sounds. Mia's voice explaining something in the earnest, detailed way she explained everything. Victoria's voice asking a question, a brief collaborative silence. Mia saying no, wait. You do it like this with the patient authority of a child who had appointed herself the expert. He'd sat in the living room of an apartment that had stopped feeling borrowed approximately 6 weeks ago, in a life that had remade itself around him, and listened to his daughter teach the CEO of a $100 million company how to frost a cake correctly. Something settled in his chest. Not a dramatic thing, just real. The particular weight of a moment you recognized as important while it was still happening, instead of only in retrospect. They ate the cake at the kitchen table at 6:30. It was chocolate, slightly lopsided on one side, the frosting applied with enthusiasm rather than precision. Mia had written our family across the top in blue icing, the letters slightly uneven, the word family slightly bigger than the others, as if she'd figured out partway through that it was the important one. Victoria looked at it for a moment when Mia brought it to the table. "I didn't know if you liked chocolate," Mia said, suddenly slightly uncertain in the way of someone who'd committed to a plan and was only now considering its variables. "I do," Victoria said. And then, Mia, this is really good. The frosting went wrong on one side. It's fine." "I know, but it says our family in blue icing on a chocolate cake," Victoria said quietly. "Nothing about it is wrong." Mia looked at her for a second, then she sat down and picked up her fork and said, "Okay, can we watch a movie after?" They watched a movie after. All three of them on the couch, Mia in the middle, the credits rolling around 9:30. Mia had fallen asleep somewhere in the last 20 minutes, her head against Victoria's arm, her breathing slow and even. Logan looked over and found Victoria sitting very still, looking down at Mia's sleeping face with an expression that she had completely given up trying to arrange. He didn't say anything. Some things didn't need words. The months that followed were not simple. They were never going to be simple. That was the truth of it, the thing that nobody in the middle of a good period liked to say out loud. The Gerald Marsh criminal referral moved through its process slowly, the way legal processes did, with delays and filings and counterfilings, and a mid-October hearing that produced inconclusive procedural results and required 2 more scheduled sessions before the year was out. Gerald's lawyers were good and well-funded and determined to extend the timeline for as long as extension was possible. But the direction was clear. The forensic report was solid. The board was unified. The record was complete. Gerald Marsh was a man in the process of being held accountable, and that process was not going to stop regardless of how long it took. Victoria ran the company through all of it, with the same focus she'd brought to everything before Logan had known her, but with, he thought, a different quality underneath it. Not less intensity, something more stable. The kind of focus that came from fighting for something you were certain about rather than fighting to prevent something from being taken. She restructured the executive team in November. 3 new hires, including a CFO and a head of operations, people she'd chosen carefully over several months. She brought Logan into the process more than he'd expected. Not officially, not yet, but as someone whose read she trusted, whose eye for the numbers she relied on. He'd started to think about what that meant in practical terms, what his own next step looked like. He had thoughts about that. He'd been turning them over for a while. Mia had her 6-month oncology check in October. The appointment was on a Wednesday morning. Logan took the day off. Victoria had a board presentation but had arranged coverage and came anyway, arriving at the hospital waiting room in her work clothes at 8:45 with 2 coffees and a breakfast sandwich for Mia, who accepted the sandwich with the seriousness of someone who had learned to eat before medical appointments because medical appointments took a long time. The 3 of them sat in the waiting room together. Mia worked on a word puzzle. Victoria read something on her phone but kept looking up. Logan sat with his coffee and did the specific thing he'd learned to do in waiting rooms. Be present without projecting. Stay in the actual moment rather than the possible ones. The oncologist was a woman named Dr. Patel, who had been Mia's doctor for 14 months, and who had the particular warmth of someone who understood that her job was not just medicine, but the architecture of a family's hope. She examined Mia, reviewed the recent blood work, asked questions, and listened to the answers with the full attention that Logan had come to recognize as the thing that made her good at what she did. When she came out to speak with them, her expression was clear. "Her counts are excellent," Dr. Patel said. "The maintenance protocol is doing exactly what we hoped. I want to continue on schedule, but I want to tell you both, her response continues to be strong." She looked at Logan. "I feel good about this." Logan heard it, felt it move through him in the specific way that good news about your child moved through you. Not relief exactly, more like a slow unballing of something that had been contracted for a very long time. Mia looked up from the word puzzle. "Does that mean I'm winning?" Dr. Patel smiled at her. "That means you're winning." Mia went back to the word puzzle with a satisfied nod, as if this had merely confirmed something she'd already known. Logan looked at Victoria. She was looking at Mia, and the expression on her face was one he had no catalog for. Something new, something that had grown in the particular space that opened up when you loved a child you hadn't expected to love. She felt him looking and met his eyes, and he saw in them the same thing he was feeling, reflected back clearly. Some things didn't need words. He decided in November, not the proposal, that came later. The job. He'd been at the same desk in the same department for 2.5 years, doing good work for a salary that no longer reflected what he understood about the company or what he was capable of contributing. He'd been thinking about it in a structured way since October, building the case the way he built everything, systematically, with specifics. And one evening, after Mia was in bed and Victoria was finishing a call, he sat down at the kitchen table with 2 glasses of wine and his notes and waited. She came out at 9:30, saw the setup, and said, "What is this?" "A proposal." She looked at the notes. "Professional or personal?" "Professional. Tonight." She sat down, looked at him with the focused expression that meant she was prepared to engage seriously. "The expansion strategy you're executing requires financial oversight at a level your current team is stretched to provide," he said. "I've been inside the records of this company for 4 months. I know the structure better than anyone except you and Anne. I have the background, I have the read on the vulnerabilities, and I have, I think you'd agree, a demonstrated ability to find the things that need to be found." He looked at her. "I want the director of financial strategy role, the one you've been trying to hire for since August." Victoria looked at him. "I know what you're going to say," he said, "that it creates a conflict of interest question given the personal situation. Anne can structure the reporting line to manage that. I've already thought through the framework." "Of course you have. The alternative is you hire someone who'll spend 4 months learning what I already know." "Logan, I'm good at this. You know I'm good at this." She looked at him for a moment, not assessing, she was past the assessment stage, more like someone taking a moment to appreciate the particular quality of the person across the table. "You negotiated your own job at the kitchen table," she said. "I also negotiated a marriage contract at a conference table. I'm consistent." Something in her expression broke slightly, the way it did when she was fighting a smile and losing. "I need to run it by Anne, of course, and the board will need to sign off. Hargrove will be fine, Caldwell too." "You've already thought about Hargrove and Caldwell." "I've had time." She looked at her wine glass, then looked at him. "Okay. Okay. But your comp expectations go in writing. Already drafted." He slid the second page of his notes across the table. She read it. Her expression moved through several things. "You're aware that this is more than you're currently making." "I'm aware. Considerably more. I'm also aware that the Director of Financial Strategy role was going to be posted at 15% above what I'm asking, and I gave you a discount because I live here and it saves commute time." She put the paper down. The fight against smiling situation had resolved itself into an actual smile, real, slightly reluctant, the version she still seemed faintly surprised to have. "Fine," she said. "Thank you." "Don't thank me. You earned it." They sat at the kitchen table and drank their wine, and Logan thought about the version of himself from 8 months ago who had stood at a different kitchen counter reading a foreclosure letter, who had been hollowed out by grief and exhaustion and the specific fear of someone watching the floor give way beneath their child, who had made a joke at a party and accidentally changed his own life. He didn't know what to call what he felt about that trajectory. The word gratitude was too simple for something with this many edges. More like awe, maybe. The specific awe of someone who had looked at the distance between where he'd been and where he was and couldn't quite account for all the steps between. He knew the steps. He'd lived each one. But knowing them and understanding how they'd added up to this was a different thing. The rooftop was Victoria's assistant's idea. Or more precisely, it was a response to Victoria saying she wanted something small and private, which had led to a conversation about venue options, which had led to someone pointing out that the building's rooftop had been renovated in the spring and had a view of the bridge that was particularly good in summer evenings, and at some point the idea had acquired its own momentum. It was a Thursday evening in July. The city had been hot all week, the specific summer heat that pressed down on everything. But by 7, the temperature had dropped to something bearable, and the rooftop was open to whatever breeze came off the water. The bridge was lit in the distance. The city spread out in every direction in the late light. It wasn't a big gathering. Victoria had specifically and non-negotiably required that it not be a big gathering. Marcus was there. He'd shown up in a suit that was slightly too formal and immediately made 3 jokes about the situation to cover his obvious sentimentality, which Logan had expected and found quietly moving. Patricia Hoying had come, which surprised Logan until it didn't. She was, he'd come to understand, someone who showed up for things she considered worth showing up for. And the lawyer and her husband. Victoria's friend Diane, who had witnessed the clerk's office ceremony and had been waiting for this, she said, since about the 3rd month. Dr. Patel had sent a message saying she couldn't make it, but had attached a photograph of Mia from their last appointment with the caption, "She's doing great," in the particular way that meant something bigger than 2 words. Mia was in a yellow dress that she'd selected herself, and which had, Logan noted, somehow acquired a grass stain on the hem within 40 minutes of arrival, which was a kind of miracle given there was no grass on a rooftop. He'd decided not to ask. She was currently standing with Diane and explaining, with great authority, the history of the city bridge as she understood it, which was confident and approximately 40% accurate. Logan stood near the edge of the rooftop with a glass of something cold and looked at the city. He thought about the last time there had been a public moment. The Arts Foundation event, Victoria's arm in his, the photographer's camera clicking, the story that had followed. The headline. The document photograph. The way the narrative had been someone else's for a while. This was different. This was theirs. He heard her behind him and turned. Victoria was in a simple dress, not the dark greens of charity galas or the boardroom charcoal, but a soft ivory, something she'd chosen for a different kind of occasion. Her hair was down. She looked like herself, the real version, not the version that ran board meetings or managed investor crises or navigated the specific brutality of public scrutiny. Just the woman he knew. The one who went quiet when she was stressed, who kept her refrigerator stocked with protein bars and expensive mustard, who had learned to frost a cake badly and been shown the correct way by an 8-year-old, who stood at the kitchen window when she needed to think and came to find him afterward. She looked at him for a moment. "You've been standing over here by yourself." "I was looking at the bridge. It's been there for 40 years. "I know." He looked at her. "I was also thinking." She stepped up beside him, looked at the city with him for a moment. The light was getting to the particular gold of late July evenings, the kind of light that made everything look considered. "This is where it became public," she said. "The fake version." "I know. That photograph was taken somewhere below us, outside the foundation." She looked at the street below. "Feels strange to be up here now." "Does it?" She looked at him. "Good strange." He reached into his pocket. She saw the movement and went still. Not surprised exactly. She wasn't easily surprised, but the stillness was different from her regular stillness. It had a kind of held quality. He'd thought about what to say. He drafted versions of it in his head over the past few weeks, which he was aware was a very him way to approach this, and which he'd abandoned somewhere around the third draft, because the versions that sounded good in his head all had the quality of a speech, and he didn't want to make a speech. He wanted to say the actual thing. When I signed that contract, he said, I was trying to keep my daughter's medical care funded and my apartment and some version of my life from collapsing completely. That's the honest truth. I wasn't looking for anything else. He looked at her. And then you were just there, in the kitchen at 3 a.m., at the board meeting, at the park in the gray afternoon with your hands in your pockets looking at the sky like you hadn't done that in years. He paused. I didn't fall in love with you at any one moment. It happened the way most real things happen, gradually, and then it was just true. He opened the ring box. It wasn't enormous, the ring. He'd chosen it himself, spent 2 somewhat nerve-wracking hours in a jewelry store with a patient salesperson who had eventually narrowed it down by reading his descriptions of her accurately. Simple gold band, a single stone, elegant without being ornamental. The kind of thing she'd actually wear. No contract, he said, no clause, no contingency. Just, I want to be here, with you and Mia, in the kitchen and the board meetings and the hard parts and the ordinary parts. I want all of it. He looked at her. If you want that too. Victoria looked at the ring, then at him. Her face was doing the thing it did sometimes, the composition completely gone, the real version present, not managed or arranged or held at any distance. Her eyes were bright in the evening light. You drafted versions of that in your head first, didn't you? She said. Several. And you threw them out. They sounded too much like a speech. She looked at the ring again. A long moment passed. Below them, the city made its sounds. Somewhere behind them, he was aware of people trying very hard to appear as if they were having other conversations. Yes, Victoria said. He looked at her. Yes, she said again, more directly, with the particular decisiveness that was one of the things he loved most about her. No hedging, no performance, just the answer. He put the ring on her finger. It fit, which was a small relief because he'd guessed at the size and hadn't wanted to ask. She looked at it for a moment, then looked at him, and then she did something she still did rarely enough that it always caught him slightly off guard. She stepped forward and put her forehead against his shoulder without saying anything. He put his arm around her. Behind them, he heard Mia's voice say, very loudly, "Finally!" And then Diane was laughing, and Marcus was saying something that was definitely going to be a toast. And Patricia Huang was smiling the smile of someone who had been correct about something again, and saw no need to announce it. Misa ran across the rooftop and hit them both at speed, one arm around each of them, her yellow dress grass-stained and her hair slightly wild from the wind. "Does this mean we're a real family now?" she asked, muffled slightly by the fact that her face was pressed between them. Logan looked at Victoria over the top of Mia's head. "We've been a real family for a while." Mia lifted her head, considered this with the gravity she applied to things that mattered. "Since the diner? Maybe before that? Before the clerk's office? Possibly." She thought about this. "Okay," she said, satisfied, and went back to Diane to continue her bridge history. Victoria watched her go. Something in her face was soft and undefended and entirely real. "She's going to be something," Victoria said. "She already is something." Logan looked at his daughter, currently holding court near the railing with the confidence of a child who had decided the world was worth engaging with at full volume. She was something before any of this. Victoria turned to look at him. The city light was gold on everything. The bridge was out there, lit and solid, doing what bridges did, holding the distance between two places, making the crossing possible. "I don't know how to do this perfectly," she said. All of it. The family part, the balance. I'm going to work too much sometimes, and I'm going to miss things, and I'm going to be difficult in ways I can't always predict in advance." "I know. I'm telling you in advance so it doesn't come as a surprise." "Victoria," he said, "I know. I have a list of things about me too." "You do?" "It's long." She looked at him for a second. Then something gave way and she laughed. The real laugh. The one that changed her face. The one she still seemed mildly surprised by. And he thought, not for the first time, that he'd do a great many difficult things to keep hearing that sound. "Okay," she said, "we'll figure it out. That's all I'm asking. Well, Gerald Marsh's criminal case resolved in the following spring. The hearing happened on a Monday in April, and Logan read the summary in the financial news on his phone over breakfast, while Mia told him something about a disagreement at school that had been resolved satisfactorily and was apparently now ancient history. The settlement had terms. Gerald had accepted a negotiated resolution that included full disgorgement of the Delvane assets, permanent disqualification from serving as a corporate director, and a financial penalty that Anne had described as significant enough to matter. Not everything Victoria's lawyers had sought, but named, documented, permanent. He showed her the article when she came into the kitchen. She read it, set his phone down, picked up her coffee. "Done," she said. "Done," he said. Mia looked between them. "Is that the bad guy?" "Yes," Logan said. "Is he going to cause trouble anymore?" "No." She returned to her breakfast with the brisk satisfaction of someone marking a task complete. Logan caught Victoria's eye over Mia's head. The look that passed between them had everything in it: the year of the arrangement, the contract and the records, and the 2 a.m. kitchen work, the board meeting and the forensic report, and the Thursday evening on the rooftop, the clinic waiting rooms and the chocolate cake with the lopsided frosting, all of it. He reached across the table and covered her hand with his. She turned hers over and held on. "Tom, there's something worth saying about the way stories like this get told. The version that makes it neat, the arc that has a clean shape. The joke that became a contract, that became a marriage, that became a love story. It sounds constructed in retrospect, like someone planned it. Nobody planned it. What actually happened was messier and more frightening and more specific than any summarized version. It was a man who had been surviving for so long he'd forgotten that surviving wasn't the same as living, and a woman who had been winning for so long she'd stopped noticing she was doing it alone. Two people with real damage, different shapes of it, differently acquired, who had been offered an unusual set of circumstances, and had, almost by accident, turned toward each other instead of away. Most things don't arrive looking like what they are. The foreclosure letter doesn't look like a turning point. The joke at a party doesn't look like the beginning of anything. The 41-page contract doesn't look like the document that changes the direction of a life. But sometimes the thing that looks like the floor giving way is actually the floor clearing, making room for something that couldn't have been built on what was there before. Logan had spent 3 years carrying grief and practical necessity and a child he loved more than anything in the world, and all that carrying had made him lean, stripped down to the essentials, unable to afford sentiment or illusion. That leanness, which had felt like damage, had turned out to be its own kind of precision. When something real came along, he could see it clearly. When something was worth fighting for, he fought. Victoria had spent 9 years building something that was entirely hers, and the price of that had been a specific aloneness she'd long since decided was just the cost of the life she'd chosen. She had not expected to be wrong about that. She had not expected a financial analyst and his 8-year-old daughter to constitute, between them, sufficient evidence that she'd made a mistake worth correcting. And Mia had survived something that children shouldn't have to survive, and she'd come out of it with her instincts sharpened and her heart intact, and a clarity about what mattered that most adults spent their whole lives trying to find. She knew who was worth trusting. She knew what family was. She had written it in blue icing on a lopsided chocolate cake and said it plainly and gone back to her word puzzle, because she was 8 and she'd figured it out and there was nothing more to add. That's the actual story. Not the joke, not the contract, not the boardroom evidence presentation. Those were the mechanisms. The story is about what people choose to do when the situation removes all the reasons to stay, and some of them stay anyway, not because of obligation or calculation, but because they found something they recognize as real, and they're not willing to walk away from it. Logan had chosen to stay. That was the whole thing. The rest was details. Zach. On a Saturday morning in August, 11 months after the clerk's office ceremony that had started all of this, Logan and Victoria and Mia went to the farmer's market 3 blocks from the apartment. It was not a significant event. Nobody planned it. It was just Saturday, and Mia wanted peaches, and Victoria had never been to this particular market despite living in the neighborhood for 4 years. And Logan wanted coffee from the stand near the entrance that Marcus had recommended 3 times. They went. They moved through the stalls in the particular loose formation of people who knew each other well enough not to need to stay together. Mia found the peaches and negotiated a transaction with the vendor with the serious efficiency she brought to commercial interactions. Victoria stopped at a bookstall and spent 7 minutes examining something while Logan got the coffee and stood in the morning light and watched her read the back cover of a book, frowning slightly, the way she frowned at everything she was genuinely interested in. Mia appeared at his elbow with 3 peaches in a paper bag. She looked at Victoria, then at Logan, with the considering expression she sometimes had. She looks like she's going to buy it, Mia said. Probably. She has a lot of books already. She does. Are you going to tell her that? Absolutely not. Mia nodded, apparently agreeing this was the correct policy. She took his hand, the natural unself-conscious way of a child, and they stood together in the morning sun watching Victoria carry the book to the vendor, say something that made the vendor laugh, and reach for her wallet. She looked up and saw them watching. Something flickered in her face, briefly self-conscious, then settling into a smile that she didn't bother to organize or moderate. She held up the book. Logan held up his coffee in acknowledgement. Mia held up a peach. Victoria shook her head slightly, smiling still, and came back to them. The morning was warm. The city moved around them. 3 people with a history that had included debt and illness and fraud and boardroom confrontations and a 41-page document signed by 2 people who didn't know yet what they were actually signing, standing together at a farmer's market on a Saturday because it was Saturday, and they wanted peaches. Simple. Real. Built by choice, sustained by effort, and worth every hard thing it had taken to arrive here. That's the story. Not a perfect one, there's no such thing, but a true one. And sometimes that's more than enough.